Hi, I'm Effie and this is What Effie Reads. It's a little bit belated, but this is going to be my wrap up of all of the books that I read in the month of July. We're in a different room today as I'm in the middle of reorganising my library ahead of my birthday on Saturday. So I just figure, film in the living room, why not? So in the month of July, I think I read 25 books, which is quite surprising considering I had to reshuffle my TBR as I injured my hand and basically couldn't read physical books for I think pretty much the whole of July. At the start of July, I finished Shows Who You Are. I'd managed to read I think 3 pages of it before the end of June. So I read that, and then later on in the month I read Rainbow Grade to kind of see how my hand was feeling, because I figured a middle grade would be fairly low stress on my hand and I wouldn't have to read it for too long, so it'd be a good test. And I think they're pretty much the only physical books I read. Everything else was either an audiobook or an ebook. Because I've got a TBR game, I kind of threw the books I'd assigned myself out the window. Not literally, obviously. And I went through the prompts and picked ebooks or audiobooks. Did I pick any audiobooks? Yeah, that still fulfilled the original prompts. They just obviously weren't physical books anymore. So I'll start off by going through the books that were on my TBR for the month, and then I will go through the rest of the books. So I'm going to start with the book that I wouldn't say I hated. I'm going to start on a slightly sour note and talk about Invisible Women by Criado Perez. This was a book that I picked up for non-fiction, and unfortunately it is very thoroughly not a recommendation. So it's meant to cover the data bias that exists whereby cis men, I'm not sure if it specifies white, but I think it's like cis white men are seen as the norm in scientific studies. And obviously by doing that, you're ignoring whole populations of people. And in theory, it sounds like a great concept. Except as I was listening to it, I just had this feeling in the back of my head that it wasn't quite right, and it wasn't sitting right with me, because sex and gender were talked about interchangeably, which is massive red flag. And then there was multiple occasions where it seemed like the author it forgot that trans people and intersex people exist. There was also a very Eurocentric, American-centric, centered on global north, Western countries, basically, and the idea of gender as binary, which is not a truth everywhere. There are multiple societies, cultures, countries, etc., where gender is not a binary. And again, intersex people exist, and so sex is not a binary either. However, Invisible Women deals with it as if it is a binary, and as if the only people that are disadvantaged are cis women. Like, there's some really weird phrasing as well. Like, I think at one point, rather than like saying it was men or even specifying that it was cis men, the author says, like, has a penis, and it's like, not all men have penises, not all people with penises are men. So, like, they didn't say it well at all. And then I went and looked it up, and it turns out that the author is in fact a transphobe. That's not great. I think what was really, well, there was a few things that were really annoying for me, but I could see that the book was making some interesting points about this data bias. And I think it's worth noting that whilst Criado Perez came from a completely like stupid point, like treating things like binary and conflating sex and gender, a data bias does exist and it needs to be addressed. But you also need to like expand on what you're talking about and explain how, you know, trans people, intersex people, yes, cis women as well, like explain how all of these people are being disadvantaged by this data bias. I think I'm also like really annoyed that I picked up this book because like I already knew that I didn't want to pick up Adichie's We Should All Be Feminists, I think it is. Like, I didn't want to pick that up because I know Adichie is a transphobe. So I picked up Invisible Women, and it turns out Criado Perez is a transphobe. And it makes me so... Oh. I did have a little bit of a moment where I went, does a trans-inclusionary feminist book exist? And then I remembered that Amanda Montell exists, and so far I've only read Wordslut from Montell, but I'm planning on reading Cultish. But I like Cultish focuses on cults, whereas Wordslut deals with linguistics and feminism, and Wordslut is trans-inclusionary, so I can thoroughly recommend it. And just in general, like Amanda Montell is good people. So if you're looking for a feminist book, and unfortunately it's dealing with some, like it's not dealing with the data bias, it's dealing with another area of feminism, but Wordslut is a great recommendation. So basically I'm saying, don't read Invisible Women, read Wordslut. And now onto the rest of the books. So I think I got like 3 or 4 non-fiction prompts. I'm sure I'll find out as I go through this. Another non-fiction audiobook that I had on my TBR for the month of July was The Wicked Boy by Kate Summerscale, and it is billed as being the story of a Victorian boy who is a murderer. And that sounded really interesting. Unfortunately, the audiobook wasn't interesting. I think I went into this book looking for something completely different than what it was giving. And that's partially to do with the blurb. The blurb doesn't accurately portray what this book is. So essentially it's a picture of Victorian England and the justice system that existed in Victorian England. And it doesn't really focus that much on the murderer. Like, you kind of follow him through his life, which again, it wasn't what I wanted from this book. And at one point it goes into a lot of detail about something to do with World War One. I don't know, like that's not my cup of tea at all. So I kind of switched off for it. It seemed like a really weird book. And to add to it, there was really, really odd quirks to the writing. So one of the things that Summerscale does is every time a character was introduced, they were, you learnt their name, and then Summerscale would tell you that they were married and they had this many kids, and it wasn't at all relevant to the narrative. And it became really noticeable that every time a character was introduced, this was being done. Yeah. So overall, not a great book, but at least I've now read it and it's one that I can tick off my list. The third non-fiction book that I had on my TBR was How to Be Autistic by Charlotte Amelia Poe. I did actually read this physically. I don't know why I forgot that I'd read this physically. It's a really quite a short book. I think it's only about 150 pages, but it ended up taking me, actually I can't remember how long it ended up taking me. Oh yeah, but it ended up taking me the best part of a whole day because it's really hard going, and I felt like I could connect so much with Poe in this book. Like, their story seemed like very niche and their experiences are very different from mine, but also the amount of things that Poe wrote about, it's really weird for a non-fiction memoir to make you feel seen, but that's how I felt reading this book, and I adored it so much. But like, be very aware of any content warnings for this book because it is a difficult book. I can't remember what the fourth non-fiction that I originally put on my TBR was. Oh, sorry, yeah. It was In Black and White by Alexandria Wilson. And I'm a bit gutted that I didn't manage to read it in the month of July, but the hand injury kind of stopped me. So instead I read Black Women in Science by Kimberly Brown Pellum. This is a children's book filled with short biographies of, as the title suggests, Black women in science. It was really interesting to see the contribution that Black women have made to science, especially because I'm so accustomed to white men being attributed to all these amazing things. So to see the true contribution was really eye-opening. I did find the book to be a little bit repetitive. But I think that's largely because I don't think it's intended to be read like cover to cover in one go. I think it's intended to be read as like in bite-sized chunks of a biography at a time. But I did really appreciate that at the end of each biography, there were actions to take to like progress your learning. The target audience for this book is young Black children, specifically young Black girls. And I can see just the pure joy this book would give those children. And it may not have been completely the book for me. It was interesting. That's probably the extent of it for me. But I do know this is a very valuable resource for children to have. And I'm glad I picked up. The remaining books on my TBR, I had to swap them all out. For the book that Jade would recommend, or I thought that I would like, I read Vicious by V. Schwab, and it's so difficult for me to know for sure, but this may be my favourite V. Schwab book that I've read to date, which is incredible. I absolutely loved the narrative. I loved how morally grey the characters were. I loved the concept of the extraordinaries. I loved the kind of lore to it. It was just such a beautiful book, and I always forget just how beautiful Schwab's actual style of writing is. And every time I pick up one of her books, I just fall in love with her writing all over again. So I'm so glad that I finally picked up this book. I do want to read the sequel soon, especially because the graphic novel, well, it's being released as comics, but the graphic novel bind-up is coming out in October, so I would like to have read both of those books before it comes out. So fingers crossed I'll actually manage that. But yeah, I absolutely love this book, and I'm so glad that I picked it up. In fact, I'm kind of happy in a weird way that I wasn't able to read the book I originally was going to read for this prompt, because I adored Vicious so much. For the book that Maddie would recommend, or I thought that she would like, I picked up The Fever King by Victoria Lee. This is a book that Maddie absolutely raved about during her mid-year book freakout tag. So I thought I'm going to have to pick this up, and it is free on Kindle Unlimited, and it's one of those where you also have access to the audiobook. So I thought, why not? And I picked it up. It sounded like a really good concept, but it just bored me to tears, and I just did not engage with it at all. I can't remember that much about it. Like, I remember the concept of like a dystopian, there's a virus that if you survive you get like powers, I think. Magical powers, I think. It kind of straddles the line between fantasy and sci-fi. There was a corrupt person at the top, and it's like, are they good? Are they not good? Well, of course they're not good, because obviously. And it was, yeah. And I'm just not interested in reading the sequel. Yes, it was queer. That's fantastic. I believe the author is also queer, but it just wasn't for me, unfortunately. But that's not to say that someone else wouldn't adore it. Like, clearly Maddie absolutely adored this duology. It just wasn't something that I enjoyed. For the prompt of a book featuring a tournament, I decided to pick up The Selection. It is, again, it's available on Kindle Unlimited, so it seemed like a good choice. It's not a book that I imagine people would associate with me, because I'm not really a romance reader, but also I love a tournament, so it seemed like it could work for me. And actually I did really enjoy it. It kind of had a feel of like Not Like Other Girls, but also it felt genuine. Like, it didn't come across at all disingenuous that this person wasn't interested in the prince. There's kind of a like a Hunger Games feel to it, where she's gone to the palace to help her family. But again, it all felt genuine and honest, and just the character of America felt really relatable. And like, obviously you know where the story's gonna go in the end, but I'm really interested to see the journey that it will take, and I'm looking forward to reading The Elite and The One, and then might as well read the other books in the series. I own the 5 books. I think it's, no, I can't remember them. I know it's like the Elite, the One, the Crown, obviously the Selection. I can't remember the Queen, maybe? No, I don't think I own the Queen. Anyway, like I can't wait to read them. Although I'm a little bit nervous that the story won't go the way I would like. I don't know. For a book that was over 500 pages, I had a really hard time picking something out for this, but I ended up reading Loki, Agent of Asgard by Elle Ewing. I am very much on the fence about this. I loved the way that Loki was portrayed. Loki's gender fluid nature was so beautifully portrayed at multiple points during this collection, and I just absolutely adored it. It was so affirming, but at the same time it really annoyed me, the repeated, for more information on this story, read this comic, which I get is something that you get with extended universes, but I just felt like I wasn't getting the full story from this collection. And for a collection of comics that was over 500 pages long and contained like, I think it was like 17 full arcs and then like 3 shorter arcs. Yeah, I didn't feel like I got the full story from it, but it was still really enjoyable. And I will always simp for Loki. Loki is just such a fantastic character, really. But there was also, I really enjoyed the character of Verity Willis as well. So I don't know where I come down on this book actually, but you know, if you enjoy comics and you enjoy if you want to know more about the story, read this. Fabulous. But for me, I feel like I have a hard enough time grasping stories as it is without them basically telling me that I'm only getting half the story. Oh, and that concludes all the books that I had to read for my TBR game. The other audiobooks that I listened to during the month of July were The Art of Dying by Ambrose Parry, Enchantée by Gita Trelease, The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern, A Kind of Spark by Elle McNicoll, and My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. The Art of Dying is the second book in the Raven, Fisher and Simpson series, written by a husband and wife duo, and it's so clear that one of the authors is a doctor because the medical knowledge feels so fleshed out, really. And I just love the way that these books are constructed. So you've got, you know, obviously you've got the characters of Raven, Fisher and Simpson, and they are complex. Like, Will Raven is not a nice guy. Like, he's a good man, but he's not a nice man. He's constantly like talking about how Sarah Fisher is like below him, how he couldn't ever like be with a maid, and like just generally being disparaging of her, and also like kind of poo-pooing any intelligence because she's just a woman kind of thing. And then you've got the character of, oh, what's his first name? I'm just going to say Dr. Simpson, who is this like famous, established doctor who has an absolute heart of gold. And you don't see as much of him in the books as you possibly would like, but also that adds to the charm, because you're going, well, I want to know more about this person. And I really enjoy the way that they kind of solve these murders. It seems really weird to be having like a doctor and a maid tracking down murderers and figuring out what's going on. But also, like, the way that the police force are portrayed as being just completely inept and corrupt makes sense that these two would take matters into their own hands. And they also seem to be kind of personally invested in the cases. So this was a really enjoyable second book in the series that maintained the charm that was established in The Way of All Flesh. And I'm really, really looking forward to reading A Corruption of Blood, which comes out, I think it's on Monday. I could be wrong. It comes out really soon. I have got an arc for it, but I don't know if I'm actually going to get to it before it comes out, as Rebirth and Redemptor are out very soon, and I'm really excited to read them. Basically, it's a toss-up between the two. I'm so excited to read both of them, actually. Enchantée is one of those books that has been around for a long time. Well, I don't know if it's a long time. Like, it's a fairly well-known book that people like. It was a middle-of-the-road book for me. Like, I don't see a need to continue the story. I know there is a sequel to it, but I felt like it wrapped up quite nicely. In this book, I enjoy the French Revolutionary setting, and the magic system was interesting, but I just found it difficult to truly care for the characters, especially because it almost felt like it was trying to set up a love triangle without actually setting up a love triangle. I don't know, it was fine to listen to. I didn't dislike it, but I also didn't like it. The Starless Sea is a book that, well, I mean, again, it's one that you've like probably heard of and multiple times. I was a little bit intimidated to pick it up because it is so long, and I'd heard such mixed things about it. In the end, I think I actually did really enjoy it. It was quite difficult to keep track of the different threads, and I think I would have preferred reading it as a physical book, and that way I could tab it and like actually mark the different threads of the story. I did like that there was multiple things going on, and the way that they all came together in the end was really cool, but it was a little bit difficult to keep track of everything, and it was also a bit timey-wimey. But I definitely think it's a book that I would potentially reread in the future. Whether I would read the audiobook, I'm not sure. I also didn't actually like that it had multiple narrators. I found it really jarring to go from one narrator to the other. I understood, or I think the reasoning is that it helps you keep track of the different kind of threads that they've each got a different narrator. But I didn't enjoy jumping from one narrator to the other in the way that it did. A Kind of Spark was a reread for me, although the first time I read it, it was in the physical form. So listening to the audiobook was a rare treat. And I really enjoyed it. I fell in love with this book all over again. Like, Elle McNicoll has such a talent for writing, and there's a reason that this book is the Waterstones Children's Book of the Year, because it is so fantastic. And the fact that, like, she gets better with her next book, because Show Us Who You Are is obviously, like, her second book, and it's so good and it's so different. And I love that I actually happened to read both of her books in the same month, and almost like bookends to the month. I started the month by finishing Show Us Who You Are. No. Yes? Yes. And then I ended the month by listening to A Kind of Spark. So it had a nice thing to it. I was a little bit worried when I first started listening to it that I wouldn't feel like it was a 5-star the second time around, but very much. It is very securely a 5-star, and I'm so glad that I was able to listen to the audiobook. The final audiobook that I listened to was My Best Friend's Exorcism, which I kind of picked up because Shannon over at Head in the Books read it recently, and I'm not going to say I had a good time with it. Like, the way that she spoke about it had me really intrigued. And I did love the way that you see the start and the end of these two's friendship. And I think it's also a good thing that I went into this book with accurate expectations of what this book would be like. And so it's not really about the exorcism. The exorcism is like this tiny chunk of the story. It's very much about their friendship and also this feeling of not really knowing what's going on, if it's paranormal or not. Apparently there's a lot of E.T. references, which, like, because I haven't watched E.T., I didn't get. And this book is very much a love letter to the 80s, which again is not my cup of tea. I tried watching Stranger Things and it just didn't do it for me. But it was a good book. And I will be reading more from Grady Hendrix. I just think it was a mixed bag. I will also note that a lot of the cool things from the book don't translate to the audiobook. For the way that the acknowledgements are done are like yearbook pages. And in the audiobook, for whatever reason, they've decided to read them like verbatim. So it makes for a really weird like acknowledgement section of the book. And kind of the same with the start of the book. There's it's like a newspaper article which does translate to the audiobook. I didn't even realise it was a mixed media portion. But again, like listening to the audiobook, you don't pick up on that. But that's all the audiobooks that I listened to. In the month of July, to kind of coincide with Darling, the physical release of Darling by Kay Ankrum, I ended up reading I ended up reading 5 different Peter Pan reimaginings or retellings. I'm not going to go into detail about them. I will say that Peter Darling by S.A. Austen Chan was my favourite of the retellings, but Darling by Kay Ankrum was also exceptional. And yeah, I actually have a full video where I went over like multiple different Peter Pan retellings of reimaginings. So if you are interested in more thoughts on those, like, do check out that video. Yeah, so I read Peter Pan in Everland by Andrea Lynn Piazza and Nicole Warren. I read Darling and Peter Darling by Kay Ankrum and S.A. Austen Chan respectively. I read Cheshire Crossing by Andy Weir and Sarah Anderson. Yes, that Andy Weir. And I read Pan Lost and Found by Gina Maxwell. And the other books that don't really fit into any categories or like into a discrete category. We've got Mary Ward, First Sister of Feminism by Sydney Thorne. This is a book that is kind of an odd one because it's basically the biography of Mary Ward, who was a nun in 1600s, I believe. So really odd one for me to pick up. But I went to a Loretto school, which are Catholic schools that are basically like the legacy of Mary Ward. So it was really interesting to see how Mary Ward's legacy actually impacted on my education, like reflecting on my time at school and kind of Mary Ward's life. It was also really fun to see that, like, her companions, buildings at my school were named after, which I don't think anyone actually told me that's why the buildings were what they were called. But like, we had a Babthorpe building, we had a Wigmore building, we had a Poynes building. And so it was all really like random, interesting stuff. And the biography was really engaging. I also really appreciated that it was written from a secular point of view. Like, it was written from a point of view of someone who comes across as agnostic. Like, there's certain points in the narrative where it almost feels like you're getting an author note going, like, I'm prone to cynicism, so I don't know what she was actually doing, but she's still pretty inspiring. Which I really appreciated. Like, there's a danger with a book about a nun that it becomes preachy and evangelizing. And I've said in the past that, yeah, I mean, my relationship with faith is a complicated one. And like, obviously I went to a Loretto school, so I was brought up as Catholic. Yeah, it's a funny old thing. But it was a really interesting read. Possibly quite a niche read. I think this book possibly has wider appeal than might be immediately obvious. And I definitely do recommend it. Like, if it sounds vaguely interesting to you, do pick it up because it's pretty good. I've talked about Show Us Who You Are by Elle McNicoll a couple of times in this video already. But it basically follows an autistic girl who is being interviewed by a company called Pomegranate, who make holograms of people, and they wish to understand neurodivergence better. And it's just a really, really cool story. Unfortunately, I can't really explain it any more than that because this book does take some twists that were quite unexpected, and I think you lose some of that if you like know they're gonna go there. Just know that it's a really good book, and like, it's another 5-star for me. So both of the Elle McNickolls that I've read were both 5 stars, and I do thoroughly recommend them. I read Survive the Night by Riley Sager. It was my first time reading a Riley Sager novel, and I don't know what to think. I think its major downfall is that it has a small cast, and I struggle with books that have a small cast as well, thrillers that have a small cast, because you kind of have nowhere to turn. Like, part of the enjoyment of a thriller is kind of trying to guess who done it and like unravel the mystery. Whereas with a small cast, you're like, well, if it's not this person, it's this person. Which is a bit of a shame. I would say I maybe guessed about half of the twists, and it's funny actually because one of the, like, possibly the final reveal I picked up on as I was reading the book, and I was like, oh yeah, I got that one. Also, like, I don't like the way that the women were written in this book, and there was a few like questionable lines that felt very clearly written by a man. It seems like a lot of people have found this book a swing and a miss though, so I'm not surprised. I will likely be picking up more books from Riley Sager. I think this probably just wasn't a good introduction to his work. And then, like, at the other end of things, I read a middle grade. I read Rainbow Grey by Laura Ellen Anderson. And unfortunately, it was another swing and a miss for me. I just didn't connect with this book, and I'm not really interested in it. I think, like, it's difficult because middle grades, like, I'm clearly not the intended readership for, but it felt really puerile, which I get, like, kids may enjoy that, but for me, I just didn't. Like, I will say the artwork is beautiful, but I found the story to be simplistic. Again, I'm not the intended audience. Yeah. So I'm not saying don't read it, just if your reading taste is similar to mine, you may not enjoy this book. And the last two books that I've got that I need to talk about are two horror books, two very different horror books though. We've got Transmuted by Eve Harms, and we've got The Venue by TJ Payne. So Transmuted is like a body horror, very dark. I think it's also meant to be kind of funny. Horror where a trans woman sees a targeted ad on Instagram for facial feminization surgery. So decides to try it out, and then all sorts of weird and wonderful turns happen. And it's dark and it's got a great ending, but I think I got lost in the middle. I think part of that is that I can't visualize things from books. So when you've got these descriptions of these monsters, I have no idea what's going on basically. And that was a real challenge for me, unfortunately. But I think it probably isn't a bad book, but do be aware that if you struggle with visualizing things from books, this may be something that you find very challenging because it does get very descriptive and you may find yourself quite lost. And then The Venue was described to me as Battle Royale, but at a wedding, which as a concept really, really intrigued me. And I just had to pick it up. Like, I wasn't sure what I thought of it initially because it didn't feel very stabby, for want of a better word. And then when the action truly started, it was just so good. It didn't get a full 5 stars from me because there was a questionable word choice in it. I don't know if it's a regional difference where something that is perceived as a slur in the UK isn't perceived as a slur in America. But I couldn't in good conscience give it a 5 star because it had that questionable word choice. But if it hadn't have contained that word, I definitely would have been giving it a 5 star. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the way that the story went. And it was very gruesome, which you kind of expect from a book that is pitched to you as being battle royale but at a wedding. And it was very much an impulse read. Someone in Spoops' Discord mentioned that it was, mentioned this book and described it in the way I've just said, battle royale but a wedding. And I was so intrigued, I just picked it up immediately and then devoured it, I think, in 2 days, which I think probably says, like, tells you all you need to know. Like, I do tend to get through books quickly, not because I'm a fast reader, but because I read a lot. But for me to have picked something up on the spur of the moment and then to have finished it that quickly tells you how much I was enjoying it. I don't know. And so we have gotten to the end of this video. I'm really sorry if this video is long and not at all concise. I'd love to know if you can think of a better way of doing these videos, because I feel like talking about 25 books every month doesn't lead to a great wrap up. But I don't know. Let me know in the comments down below if you've read any of these books or if you're thinking about picking up any of them soon. And until next time, bye!